Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Cartledge. I know that you're here because you want to master your animal training skills using a force-free approach. And to handle the variety of challenges you face, you need a broad knowledge and experience base. The problem is, we all get stuck and hit rough patches in our training, which can leave us feeling overwhelmed and helpless. Our mission since 2015 is to empower trainers just like you. The Animal Training Academy has helped thousands of trainers globally to develop skills, gain confidence, and positively influence both animal and human learners. Here's how we can do the same for you. Sign up for our membership waitlist at www.atamember.com. Register when our doors open email arrives and start growing your training skills. Build impactful training practices benefiting you and those you train. So join the waitlist at www.atamember.com. And while waiting, enjoy this free podcast show. We want to see you avoid embarrassment, overwhelm, and burnout. Instead, we want to see you build resilience to setbacks, get more organized, and grow your training skills and knowledge. In short, we want to see you enjoy confidence in yourself as a trainer and lead a fulfilling life, positively impacting the lives of the animal and human learners you work with. But let's dive into today's episode where we'll be chatting with one Kathie Nurena. Kathie is a doctor and dog trainer. She graduated from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and she completed her family medicine residency at Stanford Hospital. She is now a faculty member at that program with an interest in social determinants of health and trauma-informed care. She also graduated from the Pryor Academy and is a KPA CTP and earned her Certified Nosework Instructor Certification, CNWI. Kathie helped organise the first interdisciplinary conference for animal control officers, Department of Children and Family social workers, and other professionals in Connecticut when cross-reporting of child abuse and animal abuse became law in that state. She's long appreciated how the principles of learning theory and the positive reinforcement principles she learned in animal training were relevant to her work with humans. And perhaps some of the theories in the medical literature may be useful to animal trainers as well. So let's jump right in. I'm delighted to have Kathie here, eagerly waiting to chat. Kathie, we appreciate so much your time with us today at Animal Training Academy.
Well, I'm very excited to be here, and it's an honor. So thank you.
So to our listeners out there, we understand that your journey is driven by a deep passion to enhance your skills, your knowledge, your confidence using the most positive and least intrusive methods available. And your pursuit goes beyond personal development. It's about creating a profound positive impact on every animal and human learner that you interact with. Yet, we all recognize the undeniable truth of what we do. It is full of challenges. It's a job where feelings can weigh heavily on us, from the familiar sting of being overwhelmed to the gnawing pressures of stress and frustration, the emotional toll of compassion fatigue and the shadowy doubts of imposter syndrome. The emotional landscape of our work is complex, and one cannot downplay the unique challenges it presents. And this is why I'm thrilled to have Kathie here today. With her vast reservoir of experience spanning multiple disciplines, Kathie has spent years interacting with both humans and non-human learners. What truly excites me about today's episode is Kathie's ability to bring forth to you, the listener, a truly unique perspective, drawing from the rich tapestry of her knowledge of the science of learning and her hands-on experiences. Kathie is here to share ideas on how to navigate, understand, learn from, and ultimately be empowered by these challenging emotions we as trainers face. Today is a deep dive into understanding how we, as positive reinforcement-focused animal trainers, can harness and steer our emotions for the greater good. In our conversation, Kathie will be sharing key insights that she's gleaned over the years. Her message is clear. She doesn't want you to be consumed by feelings of overwhelm and burnout. Her mission is to equip you to bolster your skills and knowledge, ensuring not just a transient success, but a long, enduring, and impactful career. So sit back and tune in as we journey through this exploration with Kathie. So Kathie, as a certified professional animal trainer and a human doctor physician, I can't wait to hear what you've learned over your career and what you've brought here today to share with us.
Well, I think the first thing I reflected on was how much I learned from dog training conferences, lectures, and the experience, how much I was able to bring to teaching. Because we've talked about imposter syndrome and how that can be a little bit debilitating. And as a new attending, teaching residents who are not that much younger than me, I thought, what could I bring them? And what did I know that they didn't know? Because it was obvious to me. And I watched dog trainers and agility trainers teach me and my Maltese how to be a better team. And I was fascinated by a workshop I went to where at the beginning, I'm like, what am I doing here? There are people with all of their border collies ready to go who understand what a front cross is or what a rear cross is, 2 on 2 off, and all of these terms that I didn't know. So at the start, I just raised my hand. I'm like, I don't know that I belong here. And she's like, oh, you're fine. You're fine. And she was an expert teacher who could help any team do better. And to me, that was so insightful and empowering that there were skills that I had that I could impart to residents. And if they were having trouble, how would I approach them if they were an animal? Like I could relate to the deficits, whereas I couldn't really see that I had much more to offer a doctor who was so close to me in training. So just that power of being able to look at a situation, see what was needed, experiment a little bit with the teaching to help that learner be successful. And that wasn't something I'd seen modeled very much in medical education.
You're talking to one community of human learners that you're involved with, and that is the animal training community. And you're also stepping between industries, between communities, and stepping into your role as a physician. I think everyone listening can appreciate and understand the pressures that your role as a physician entails for an industry closer to ours, and there's going to be listeners of this show who fit into this industry, veterinarian professionals. We can all understand and have a lot of strong emotions and empathy towards those in the vet industry, because there are some really hard to swallow statistics about mental health in that industry. Can you just share with us about what it's like to be a physician, how you've found it, and how from your time interacting with positive reinforcement trainers and understanding the imposter syndrome that you just talked about, and all of the challenges that we face in our roles, because they're both caring roles, what are the similarities and what are the differences, if any?
Yeah, I think I've had an opportunity to kind of compare human medicine with veterinary medicine. My friend and frequent kind of co-presenter, Linda Randall, is a vet. And she and I would often process the animal training seminars that we went to in the context of the medical office. And she and I, for a long time, just saw such similarities. And I think it is a lot of the empathy that you talk about. When you hear people's stories, you see some of the challenges they face, whether it's as a trainer and, a lot of varying competition in the home for attention and resources, or in the office. People don't always do what we want them to do, what we know might be best for them. Family medicine is a specialty where we talk about preventative care and, eat healthy and exercise. And it can be so disheartening when you give all of the counseling and people don't take it to heart. And usually it's not until something catastrophic happens, where you see that. And it can be hard not to get jaded, not to get kind of just frustrated with saying the same thing over and over again. And one thing that I try to help the residents remember is we're saying it over and over again, but each patient is only hearing it that one time that we say it to them. So it is having some patience for the situation and maybe the slow response that people have. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, one question that has come out of that, or one opportunity to put a shout out, because we're going to talk about community today. And you mentioned your collaborations with Linda Randall, who is a appreciated member of our community. And you can listen to an ATA podcast episode actually with Linda Randall on our Making Ripple show. We'll link to that in the show notes. Do you want to share with everyone your collaboration with Linda and how you guys met? Because I think that's quite a fun story to incorporate at this stage.
It is a fun story. I'm in Connecticut. Linda's originally from Connecticut, and now she's in Ohio. My sister's husband had often told me about his cousin. Oh, you'd love to meet her. She's in Ohio. She's a veterinarian. She does agility. She has a training facility. And my sister and her husband are not particularly animal people. So I did not think their recommendation of compatibility would hold any water. But it was very kind and curious, and it was on like that kind of list of things to do. And then we had met some of Tom's family at a family event, and they were soon having their big family reunion. So we went to Danbury, which is about an hour from where we are. So, it was definitely something planned and decided. And Linda happened to be there. And Linda and I met, and we chatted about all things dog training. We talked about, KPA. We talked about the ranch. We talked about various different conferences. And it was very fun to listen to her cousin try to keep up with us. And she'd be like, oh, no, Tom, we're talking about something else, because it was just such a natural and flowing conversation. And there was a conference that was coming up that was actually at Montefiore Medical Center, a medical conference, but looking at some of the work by Dr. Levy about using essentially clicker training with orthopedic residents. So she came to that, and we started going to animal training conferences together. And that's where that conversation started about how really so much intersected both the animal training and other caring professions, like the medical professions. So it was fun, and my sister was right. Linda and I needed to meet.
Kudos to your sister. And now, for those listening, a lot of them are very aware of Clicker Expo and the Karen Pryor Academy. And excitingly, you and Linda have a collaboration coming up at the Clicker Expo in January. Do you want to share with our listeners what they can learn from that opportunity in a couple of months' time?
Yeah, Linda and I have spoken a bit about trauma-informed care and some of the things that we'll touch on. And I do think it really resonates with the caring professions. We've also kind of started looking at that intersection between health and behavior, and how things like vaccines may impact behavior stages, a little bit about vaccine hesitancy, which seems to be a big issue right now, especially with rabies, when you hear some of those things that the veterinary literature is talking about, the amount of that. So we'll be looking at the intersection of health and behavior from a more kind of zoonotic infectious disease perspective, but it should be it should be interesting for sure.
Well, I know a lot of our listeners of this show are also keen participants in that event, so I'm sure you'll get some of them attending your event. And if you're in a chat there, say hi to Kathie, let her know that you listened to her on the podcast.
Oh, we would love that.
You've got this amazing perspective gained from your... for you sitting there listening to me say that, you're like, well, it's not amazing, it's just my perspective. But for us and the listeners of the show, we're not medical professionals, so we see the world differently, I imagine, because you've seen a lot. You've worked with amazing families, you've helped a lot of people, and you've been through one we can all appreciate would be a lot of struggles for some of the things you've already talked about. The imposter syndrome, the clients not following through on your advice until there's some kind of emergency. As training professionals, as animal care professionals, we can all relate to that. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with the listeners of the show in terms of what you've learned over time, and how we can take those learnings from your experiences and your perspective to become empowered ourselves and to use those emotions, because I think that's something that is powerful, is to listen to them and use them and become empowered by them to help move us in the right direction. So I think you've put 5 ideas for us. Is that right? Can you get us started with number 1?
I will start with the concept of trauma-informed care. And just to give a little bit of background about trauma-informed care, that came out of some of the work that Kaiser did in surveying their patients on the West Coast on adverse childhood experiences. They surveyed their patients to see if they had experienced in childhood things that would be considered traumatic or adverse, like the loss of a parent, abuse, whether it was neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, stress in the household like domestic violence, substance abuse, which is such a common problem for so many families, or a household member that was in jail. And they looked at that and they saw the higher your ACE score, the lower your overall health was. And in fact, correlated potentially with an earlier death. So it was pretty stressful. And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, developed what's called trauma-informed care, which really just acknowledges that people have experienced trauma in their life. And how do we make them feel welcome in a safe place so they can get, and this was for mental health, so get the health care they needed. And they have certain tenets that they want to do, and they definitely want to realize there was trauma, to avoid re-traumatizing people by coming to the doctor. Sometimes it can be stressful and people can feel judged. It can be too hard to, get the services you need. They emphasize things like safety, choice, collaboration, and being trustworthy to that patient, and also empowering the patient. And really you could put in client for that in various settings. So that's a little bit about trauma-informed care. And it seems like it correlates or, has some similarity with Lima. And what you're trying to do is really to avoid potentially re-traumatizing the animal. Linda likes to talk about not so much trauma-informed care, but trauma-assumed care, which works perfectly in the veterinary setting because the animals can't necessarily speak and share their stories.
It's relatable to an animal in that you don't know what the background is for that individual animal, but there are events which, although they're not present in the moment now, are impacting the individual in the moment now.
Yeah. And it's almost probably like a chronic stress. And we're learning more how stress can impact health. And does it make people avoidant to go to the doctor? If going to the doctor takes away some of their independence and some of their choice, right? No one wants to go and be told, you must do this, but have more of negotiated goal setting. There's more than one way to screen for colon cancer. So a colonoscopy may be the gold standard, but there are other options. Or if you don't want to do that, why? And really kind of giving them options.
How does the listener of this show, as they're thinking about this and they're thinking about Lima or Susan's hierarchy of behavior change or whatever model that you use to make your decisions about what interventions you're going to use with an animal, where in your words, how do we incorporate this new information about trauma-informed care? Because if you, the listener, are like me, then this is the first time that you've heard this and you've started to learn about this. And how does that help us as trainers working with clients, because ultimately the behaviour that we're changing as humans 99% of the time, unless we're someone that works with animals exclusively, but that's pretty much impossible. Where's the intersection and the best way for us to leverage this information to help look after our clients and also to help look after ourselves?
I think we've talked about mental health and how there's much more awareness of the stress and mental health needs of so many people. And we've talked about the stats with veterinarians, so we know mental health is an issue. I think trauma-informed care is a way of just acknowledging that and finding a gentle way to approach people. And some of the examples they use are really to help in advance think about situations that may seem confrontational and how do you diffuse them or not just make assumptions that this person is being difficult. It's almost like, you hear with the reactive dog, your dog isn't being a problem, your dog is having a problem. And that's actually very similar to what the trauma-informed care training tries to give to providers is, it's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And those subtle word differences can give that patient, that person, space where it's not so much blame or internal or there's something wrong with you, but there's a situation that needs to be looked at, analyzed, and move forward.
And is this something that you teach to other physicians?
It is. And it's something that, Linda and I have spent some time talking, and we've talked to people like veterinary social workers and all of that. It is becoming more commonly taught in med schools as an approach, like something like motivational interviewing may be taught. How do you interview people and get them excited for behavior change, or at least feel it's possible? We have medical students who rotate through us, and so they're hearing a bit more about it. They're learning a bit more about it. It is a concept that's difficult to integrate into organizations. So it does tend to be that one kind of champion or person talking about it, and then they tell a friend, and it just becomes more of an awareness at an organizational level that we have found is very hard to institute. But the more people are aware of it and it becomes part of how an individual handles a patient, it then becomes important to those administrators that are higher up, where you actually might be able to do more formal training in trauma-informed care. So it may not be a dramatic policy change, but just that kind of awareness of this approach to try to avoid re-traumatizing people, giving them choice and empowerment. And what they found is it doesn't only help the patient experience, but it helps interactions with coworkers and front staff and colleagues and just everybody. It kind of becomes a way of interacting where everyone's kind of given respect and, and acts in a way that's trustworthy.
And so for it's the client who might not be following through on advice, which if you're the listener, I know that you're saying, yeah, I've been there.
Yes. Yes.
But it's what you're saying is there's nothing wrong with the client. It's not that the client's wrong, it's what's happened to the client.
There may have been some barrier that keeps them from doing that next step, taking that next step. I think if we're in a culture of blame, like this is a difficult client and this is a difficult patient, and we've all said that. But if we try to find that common ground, somewhere where we can work forward from, it might be more helpful.
I'm curious if you can give us some examples, and you can tell me that this is not something that you can do as a physician. Give me some examples of how you've implemented this in your role as a physician, and also how you've implemented it in your role helping people out with their animals.
It's going to seem like a small, low stakes example, and that I think that's a good type of example. I had a woman who was probably in her late 60s, and She'd been a patient of mine for about a year and a half. And she was not big into doctors, not big into medicine, which is perfectly fine. She didn't want to do mammograms. She didn't want to do colonoscopy. And in the back of my head, all I can think of is if something happens, there's a certain degree of liability. Like, why don't you want to do these things that are good for you and going to keep you healthy? And I knew she had children. And oftentimes that liability may be more the kids are going to be so upset. Like, why didn't you have my mother do these things? So I'm trying to encourage her to do that. Her previous doctor had retired, which is why I didn't have a long relationship with her, because over time you can work on those things. And she came in one day and she wanted to be tested for hemochromatosis. And I know that I had already had this defensiveness when I went in the room. And she wants to be tested for this disease, which isn't recommended to be screened for. It's a problem when there's too much iron in the blood. If you have that, the iron can deposit and cause kidney problems, liver problems. But usually when it's clinically relevant is in young patients, they're sick with it. So here's a woman who's lived her whole life, and if she has this gene, it hasn't had a lot of impact for her health. So I had to ask, why? You won't do a mammo, you won't do colonoscopy, you won't do the routine stuff. Why this exotic disease? And it turned out her brother had been diagnosed with it. He was a little bit older than her. The gene testing was relatively new. So it wasn't how we typically diagnosed it. We would find it when we were working up abnormal blood values. And she was afraid that her kids would have it. And all of a sudden, that made sense. And it's not like a judgment on my part, but it's like, oh, she just wants to take care of her children. Some of my stress for her not doing her screenings was thinking of her kids. So it's this kind of unifying moment, right? Where, yes, we're worried about your family and your family's well-being. And so we talked about it, and there's some potential downside to if she tests and tests positive and then her kids test for it, there may be some implications for life insurance. After Obamacare, pre-existing conditions shouldn't affect your ability to get health insurance, but maybe life insurance. So we talked a little bit about that. She tested for it. She tested negative. But in that moment when I kind of understood, it was like a weight was lifted and I was less defensive. You don't always get a nice articulate reason because sometimes people don't even know why they're being defensive. But if you assume that there's some barrier that's keeping them because people aren't trying to be unhealthy, it can make it a little bit easier. But it is always really nice when people just tell you and you understand. And I'm trying to think of an animal example. I tend to do more of the nose work training. Maybe now is the hospital has a facility dog, and some of the training they're doing, they don't want to put treats on the floor. And some of the exercises, it would be really nice to just be able to put treats on the floor, but they don't want the dog scoffing up. So just had to understand that. Again, it's not a high stakes moment, but why can't we do reward placement here? Oh, because at least to the handler, that would be a problem. So, okay, we'll think of something else.
And in your words, I'm getting the feeling that for the listener of this show, the big takeaway, whether it's embracing trauma-informed care or some other model, and I've got some in my mind that I think it shares similarities in so much as they challenge you to assume good intent in others. They challenge you to, and I feel like a lot of self-help books and I don't mean to put them in the same category as trauma-informed care. I know a lot of work's gone into that because for some people, saying the word self-help book has specific connotations. But for a lot of the personal development literature, I get the main takeaway is just trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand things from their perspective. And the thing that keeps coming to my mind from everything you've just said then is that one thing you said when you asked why and she told you, you felt like a weight had been lifted off your shoulders. So I'm curious in terms of when you teach this and I know for you, it's really front of mind in terms of what you want to share with our listeners. Is it to gain a appreciation and be more helpful towards clients, or is it also, and or separately, to help us remove the burden of the responsibility that we try to take on for other people's behavior? Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And I think, yes, on both fronts, because we do. And you see that with the residents, right? Where they don't want to fail the patient. And the patient has all of these obstacles or doesn't, we don't know. It's just not doing it. And there's only so much you can do because you do want to empower that learner, that patient, that person for self-care, and not do it all for them. We've had lovely residents who want to help arrange transportation and do all of these things. But if they did that for every patient, they would never leave the office. And that's where things like burnout can come in, right? All the best intentions, but I think you're absolutely right. I think it's that win-win. It is good for the patient or the client. It's good for the staff that you work with and your interactions with them. And it's good for you.
And you talked about burnout there, which I think is a nice transition to share some of the other things that you brought to this episode today that you've learned over your time working as a physician and as a positive reinforcement focused dog animal trainer. Can you talk about some of the other topics that you wanted to bring up today?
Yes, I think that burnout is an important topic that people are talking about. And sometimes it's hard for me to distinguish who's talking about it. Am I hearing it in the healthcare setting, in the animal training world? And the more I thought about it, the more I wonder if it's talked about enough in the animal training world, and maybe it is. Some of the jokes in healthcare is everyone's talking about burnout, and they're scheduling mandatory meetings to address wellness and how you can do that. But mandatory meetings is actually the antithesis of what might be helpful. It's more work. But I do think in healthcare, there's a lot of very structured, and I think it's true in human medicine and veterinary medicine, organizational infrastructure to look at productivity and reimbursement because of third-party payers and all of that. So people are looking at that and creating modules and education and identifying it as a problem. And I think the problem is probably equally widespread in other of the giving professions. So we talk a lot in medicine at our hospital about the Maslow Burnout Index. And it seems it's looking at burnout and factors. It's commonly used. It's been kind of validated, so everyone speaks that language. But animal trainers talk about not what you don't want the dog to do, but what you do want the dog to do. So there seems to be a little bit of a piece missing to me for some of that about the resiliency in it. It just seems a little bit negative focused. So I looked at some other tools, and there's ProQual, Professional Quality of Life tool, which is similar, but has done a nice job of looking at what they'll talk about is compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction. And until I found that tool, I hadn't really thought about it as a spectrum. It's not like you're burnt out and that's it, but somewhere on that spectrum of being happy at work and feeling like you're doing good and contributing versus feeling that drained and burnt out. A lot of that research talks about burnout and that feeling of hopelessness related to work. They talk about secondary traumatic stress. So we go a little bit back to trauma. But you are seeing families who may be dealing with behavior issues, with euthanasia for veterinarians. There's a lot of secondary traumatic stress that you endure. And so it was interesting to read the results of some of the studies they did with the ProQual survey. And the older I get, the more I find it somewhat reassuring that age and education seems to be affiliated more with compassion satisfaction, or you kind of increase on the spectrum towards compassion satisfaction. So it's not all negative, but you can I love the fact that education was a component of that, because I do enjoy going to the conferences and learning and thinking about different philosophies, how they may or may not be applicable. In that the study, kind of the Sentinel study that they looked at social workers who were working with human clients with post-traumatic stress, and specialized training in post-traumatic stress increased their compassion satisfaction. So I think, choosing your tool and looking for the positives is helpful.
So compassion satisfaction. So you're satisfied with the level of compassion you have?
It's more professional satisfaction. You feel like the job you're doing is making a difference and not taking more from you than it gives you.
And you're advocating here for, and I like it a lot, and I'll tell you why I like it a lot, is for reframing your thoughts to steer towards compassion satisfaction as opposed to steering away from compassion fatigue. And the reason I like it is because I realized in myself when I burnt out really badly in 2020, and when I say burnout, that means the same as what you mean when you say burnout. We won't go into that here. But it wasn't a nice experience. Let's just put it that way. I attribute it to the overwhelming feeling I had from the amount of responsibilities in my life, including work and including family and including everything else. And I found that I was trying to do behaviors to avoid burnout. So I was in a negative reinforcement contingent. And it was Gabby B, if you're listening to this, Gabby B, ATA member, grateful to you for pointing this out to me. It was realizing that if I reframed that so that I was learning new behaviors to gain access to something like compassion satisfaction, then all of a sudden I'm thinking in a positive reinforcement contingency. And if we think about how emotions track contingencies, and if you've got lots of positive reinforcement in your life, you're going to hypothetically feel happy, joy, positive emotions. That was a big revelation, and I'm hearing that in what you're saying here.
I think yes. I think that's it. And it's interesting because I don't hear that so much with the Maslow scale as much as ProQual. And how do you do that? But it is, I think that's exactly it.
Can you just unpack a little bit for the listeners, Maslow scale and ProQual? When you say those, what do you mean for someone who's never heard of them before?
Yes, they're questionnaires that people answer. How do you feel about work? Do you feel drained? And I don't have them kind of in front of me, but you can look them up, and maybe we can put those in the notes as well, just to see. And what they did with that data when they analyzed it, the ProQual had more kind of positives and pulling out, and it does seem like that framing with it. And there may be studies with Maslow that I didn't see, but even the residents when we worked with, some who had studied burnout and resiliency in the emergency room, were using two surveys to try to measure burnout and resilience. And survey fatigue is something that people have too. They get a survey for everything. So they're just tools, except you'll see them referenced a lot once they kind of become a validated tool. And I was talking with some of the people in our hospital that are on the wellness committee, take this very seriously, and no one can quite figure out why it was Maslow and not ProQual that became the standard that we hear a lot about. And there may be places where they do more of the ProQual, but I just really enjoyed that reframing component to ProQual, which seemed fairly powerful.
Yeah, interesting. Looking at the time, what I'm going to say is I'm, from a personal perspective, very interested in learning more about these questionnaires. I haven't heard of them before, and I think they will have a lot of value for the listeners of this show. So we will try and link some links. We'll try to link some links to the write-up for this episode, but as Kathie said, Google them as well, and because of their use, their common use, they will pop up in Google, is what you're saying, Kathie?
They will.
Awesome. Now, there's another thing that you talked to me about before we push record today, and that is hope. And I was hoping, I'm getting good at this. I was hoping that you could talk to Hope, and we'll link to some links about Hope for you as well.
Well, and this was a little bit of a revelation. I guess being a positive reinforcement trainer, you're always looking for that kind of positive angle. I'm also not a huge fan of acronyms, but I really think they nailed it. And it's, again, an evolution of ideas. We started with ACEs and the adverse childhood experiences. And HOPE is a program out of Tufts University where they're studying what we all wish or hope to be true, that positive experiences can counter some of the adversity that you felt and you can be healthy. So it's healthy outcomes through positive experiences. And it's exciting to see people studying it in a very real way, because it's one thing to know your ACE score. It's an easy metric to study if you wanted to do, some scholarly activity. But do you need to know someone's ACE score, or do you just assume that they
What
they
is
may
an
have had
ACE
trauma?
score, by the way?
Adverse childhood experiences.
Oh, yes.
So
You did mention it earlier, I think.
yeah, and this is why I'm not a huge fan of acronyms. But HOPE just says it all. So you go from adverse childhood experiences. You don't necessarily need to know their number if you're doing a more trauma-informed care approach. And if you can make positive experiences for them, it can improve their health.
So how just stay, we're going to stay with Hope, but I wish I'd asked about ACE earlier, and trying to think about, for the listeners of this show, next steps that they can take after listening to this. And unless you've got survey fatigue, maybe you can move towards survey satisfaction. But I think checking out some of these questionnaires would be of interest to our listeners. So for the ACE, and let's talk about HOPE and let's focus on HOPE. For the ACE, the aversive childhood experience and getting the score, is that a survey you fill out as well? How does that work?
It is. It's a small survey. And at least I find when you look at it, it can be a little bit subjective, right? Are you trying to get a more sympathy, more empathy with a higher score? What constitutes neglect? It can be subjective. And, I don't know that you need a score to give people that kind of benefit of the doubt or assume the best in them.
Cool, thank you for that. And now HOPE. Let's move back on to HOPE.
Yeah. So it's out of Tufts. They have some studies going, some pediatric studies. It's newer. And I want to say maybe about 2018 or 19. And then COVID came. So I don't know how many clinical studies have come out. But they've done some just really nice things. You and I had talked a little bit about community. And from what I remember, their logo was designed by people in their community who might have been a little less engaged, but wonderful artists. So they're kind of branching out and really trying to support community while they're looking to show that doing that, kind of giving people positive experiences may actually improve their health.
So healthy outcomes through positive experiences. And 2018, 2019, they're about community. What else is the meat of this? Is saying what is the meat of this approach? Is it an approach? Is it how does the listener of the show, what do they do next after learning about HOPE here today?
For me, when I found it, it was just, someone's taken that next step. So I don't know that there's anything more to do except try to create community and positive experiences, whether it's for yourself or for your community. And someone can do the kind of the scientific research to say that it will make a difference in people's health outcomes.
So we've talked about trauma-informed care today, giving people the benefit of the doubt. We talked about compassion fatigue, which we often talk about, but the other end of the continuum, which is compassion satisfaction. And these are actually tools that people can, questionnaires that people can leverage for themselves or for others. And whilst I say that, a question's popped into my mind. So if you do the pro-qual questionnaire and you find out that you are on whatever part of the continuum, But if it's a part of the continuum, and if you're listening to this podcast and you're feeling a little bit compassion fatigue, so I know for me as an employee in zoos, which I was for a long time, and when you're working in such large collections of animals, death becomes common place, as I'm sure it would be as we know it is in the medical profession and the veterinary profession. And I lost compassion towards that. It just became, I had no feelings around it. And now that I've been out of employment for a long time, I got that compassion back. That was my experience with it. So maybe you listen to this podcast and you are aware of changes in your compassion towards areas of your work. And you do the pro-qual questionnaire, and you find out that you're wherever you are on the continuum. What is the next step for someone after doing that? Does the pro-qual have recommendations and strategies?
The pro-qual doesn't have recommendations. And, none of this is meant to be medical advice per se. But I think you illustrated what next steps could be, which is really finding support. And as mental health becomes more important to society and more resources, there's some really interesting mental health resources, not just for employment issues, but just in general, depression, anxiety, but finding community and support there. So it can vary by region, what resources there are. There's some really interesting efforts to make more national support. So relatively recently, a suicide and crisis hotline in America came out, 988, which is similar to our 911. And so I think it just speaks to the importance it's taking in society, where we want to have people who could have access quickly, because American healthcare access can be an issue, and it's not always the most kind of therapeutic or easy to navigate. So there are certain national resources like that, like 988. There's an interesting text crisis text line. So you can text. And as I was learning about that and talking about it, one of the medical students who was rotating with us had been a volunteer for that. So she was so excited that we were talking about it. So there's various resources, but it's the connection, I think, and the community, which is why groups like ATA can be helpful, and looking for that kind of positive environment, a safe place to learn, to vent, to explore options, on some of the listservs, options for clients and other perspectives can be really helpful.
Well, I may be biased, but I completely agree. I joke, but I know how many of our members we've helped and how many lives we've changed, and it's through the resources we share, but it's within the resources we share within the community that they're shared that I think is a nuance, and it's a small hinge, but it swings a big door, I think, in terms of the change that it makes for feeling safe, taking on new information and exploring it with others. Safe being the key word there.
It is a little bit like preventative medicine, in that sometimes you will never know the impact that you have by just offering yourself, anyone, just by being there. It's always interesting, those stories where, years later, someone came back and said, you were very impactful. And sometimes it just doesn't get back to you, which is what primary care medicine is. Hopefully you never have this problem because of the steps we took for prevention or screening. So just being satisfied with that level of effort can help your compassion satisfaction.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything with us today, Kathie. One final question for this episode. Could you share with us what you want to see happen in the animal training world, specifically over the next 5 to 10 years from where you're sitting, from where you've entered the industry, and with your knowledge and experience and the things we've talked about today? What do you want to see happen moving forward?
I love that idea of community and would love to see community develop further or kind of sustain itself and keep growing. One thing I have loved about the animal community is the curiosity and really the most scientific explorers of solving behavior problems. So it's a very curious community and, seemingly open with the positive reinforcement. As I thought about this, one kind of grand idea is maybe creating community for children. And I don't know what that might look like, but I think who better to experience positive reinforcement with animals than children? And it may help on so many levels. We don't know because we don't have the data, but maybe the scientists at Hope would look into that, to help with resources, resiliency, to help with bullying and all the things that kids have to go through. I think positive reinforcement trainers have so much to offer there.
Yeah, I agree. And Kathie, I think you'd really like our podcast episode with Bex Tasker from here in New Zealand, who's doing amazing things with positive reinforcement in children and bringing them together to teach them, horses and sheep and dogs and all of the animals on their property. So totally agree with that.
So that would be nice, and I will have to check that out because it's exciting to see what other people are doing.
Well, thank you. Do you want to just remind everyone listening, you're speaking, as we mentioned earlier, at Clicker Expo. You and Linda have spoken at a few industry conferences and are speaking at Clicker Expo. Do you want to remind everyone where they can go to hang out with you in January?
Yes, that's going to be at Clicker Expo Live, so the virtual conference. I think the website is up and registration is open. And we would love to hear from people from various communities from AAT, because I know Linda really enjoys the community as well. So we will be there. We have had the privilege and pleasure of speaking, and I think talking about this is so important for everyone's well-being and their professional satisfaction.
Amazing. And we're going to link to all of the stuff we've talked about in the show notes today. This has been so much fun. Even though it feels a little bit awkward saying that because of the topic of the conversation, but it has been fun.
And it's a relief to talk about it, I think.
It is. And so from me and behalf of everyone listening, we really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today. Thank you so much, Kathie.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you as well so much for listening. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. It's our hope today's conversation sparked inspiration and added some tools to your trainer's toolbox. Remember, every training challenge is an approximation towards becoming a better trainer. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them, and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.atamember.com to join our waitlist and be the first to know when our membership doors open again. There you'll find a supportive community of trainers just like you, working to make a positive difference in the lives of animals and humans alike. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay resilient, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We're here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.